Thank you so much, Nika and Serena and Books Are Magic, and Vlad and Evie. We are so excited to be here today.
Yes.
All right. So,
We're excited too.
yay. We're going to get started by like it's church. If you turn your books to, okay. So, we're going to just do a short reading of one of the good ones. This is at the beginning of the story, so you get a sense of where our characters are starting out, and then we'll get into some conversation with Vlad and Evie.
All right, here we go.
Chapter 1, Happi. Thursday, July 26th, 3 months, 9 days since the arrest. Chicago, Illinois.
She was mine before she was anyone else's. All mine, partly mine. Now she belongs to you and them and shirts and rallies and songs and documentaries. They say she had a bright future ahead of her, and she was a star whose light burned out too soon. She was going to make a difference. That's all true, but it's not the truth. Kezi was more than her brains and her grades and her voice. She was more than her future. She had a past. She was living her present.
She could have been mine.
Should have been mine.
She was my sister before she became your martyr, after all. Even as I sit as still as a lion stalking her prey, inside, I'm racing. My mind is buzzing with the thoughts I don't say. My heart is knocking erratically against my sternum and is always one beat away from bursting through my chest. I should be used to it, but you never get used to strangers sliding their arms over your shoulders in solidarity to apologize for something that isn't their fault. Not when Kezi being gone doesn't feel real to begin with. How can it? When I didn't get a chance to see her face one last time before they incinerated her body and put her essence in an urn.
My parents are already inside the auditorium, seated in their place of honor in the front row. I will join them eventually, but not until the millisecond that I have to. When everything went down, we made an agreement. I will play along and be a cheap carbon copy of the daughter they lost, a constant reminder to the world that she was one of the good ones. But before the lights shine on us and cell phones are trained at our brave, heartbroken faces, I will be me, the prodigal daughter.
The end.
Hey,
really.
y'all.
That's fantastic. I mean, just in listening to you just read just those first couple of paragraphs, I'm already sort of drawn in. And I have so many questions for all three of you. I have my copy of one of the good ones. I'm very familiar with Punching the Air. And I guess the first question that I think everybody who's ever had an opportunity to meet authors and people who write books for a living is, how did you come up with the story? Because what attracted me when you first told me about this book that was coming out and you told me it was called One of the Good Ones, I had that moment where I go, well, I know what that means.
Yeah.
You know, it's like as soon as you hear the title, you think that you already know at least what one of the principal traits of one of the characters is going to be. But then, of course, like all great books, it completely takes you in a different direction. So first to you, Maika and Maritza, how did you come up with the idea for this sophomore effort?
Yes. So one of the good ones came to us basically, I would say a few years ago, actually. Our great aunt passed away and we went to the mausoleum for the funeral. And while we were walking around, we were looking at the names of some people who had already passed on, and we came across Trayvon Martin's name. And that really stuck with us because we're from Miami, and at different points, our youngest sister attended the school that Trayvon Martin attended, and basically the places that he would have frequented in Miami was our Miami as well. And so if you had been living your life in a state of ignorance, I would say, about the way that race works in this country, I know that what happened to Trayvon Martin was a real eye opener, and that stuck with us. And we decided that when we were going to write this book, One of the Good Ones, we wanted to focus on the family members that are left behind in the midst of these very public tragedies. Because when a Black person is victimized or brutalized by the police or a vigilante, you'll see the media or even people try to figure out some way to justify the person's death. Like, oh, how were they talking? What were they wearing? Did they smoke weed? All of these different things. And that really shouldn't matter at all. But that's where the idea of the story came from. And we decided to explore that through a lens of sisterhood and taking a trip through time.
And, we're first. Oh,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, we're first generation Americans, Haitian, like all y'all. And a lot of times when immigrants come to the country, you really feel like you have to put your best foot forward and make sure that you don't do anything to mess things up. And then you'll be okay and an American. And we wanted to tackle that idea of like being able to be perfect in any way, or that it's possible to do anything, to go to a particular school or get a certain degree, or have a particular job to save you from being Black in America.
Yeah, and that's something we'll talk about. I mean, it's almost expected. It's like, I don't think that, at least in my generation, and I don't want to age myself, but it's almost, I mean, there was no question that you would behave and act in a certain way, and your schoolwork would be, perfect. Parents didn't care. What I find fascinating, and Ibi, your book, Punching the Air, deals with somebody who's wrongfully incarcerated. What I find really fascinating is that you all have chosen to, marry your perspectives as first generation Americans or immigrants to this country with the reality of being a person of color in this country. And so, Ibi, how did you sort of, what kind of perspective were you able to bring to this subject? Because it's not one, I could see my mother thinking to myself, well, a book about somebody wrongfully incarcerated, and this might upset a lot of people, but she might say something like, well, that's probably an African-American person, not a Haitian-American person, because we're supposed to be perfect. We're not supposed to break the law. I mean, oftentimes they talk about the model minority when they talk about Asians. That's a stereotype of Asians, but I found it to be true of the expectations of some of our parents and some of our elders for anybody born outside of this country, that you're expected to sort of follow the rules and, just keep your head down. Doesn't matter what's happening around you, and just do the right thing.
Well, first of all, I'm going to correct you a little bit, Vladimir. For my parents, or my mother wouldn't say African American, she'd say Black American. Black American, and there was like, it's not, and I, at the risk of sounding very problematic, it would be like a little bit of a disgust with it.
Yeah.
and
I'm glad you broke out the mom accent, because
right.
I was going to do that a little later.
Right.
I do it on national TV all the time, but like,
we may not be able to cover it in this conversation, but just being immigrants, Black immigrants, there is a hierarchy that Black immigrants have in their minds when they come to this country, in terms of just like, you have all this, and you cannot accomplish. I mean, it's terrible mindset, but I personally grew up with it growing up in New York City. So yes, my mother would be like, okay, that's probably not a Haitian person that this happened to. You are correct. The perspective that I bring to this kind of story, and I'm sure Maika and Maritza bring that same perspective, is this perspective of being on the outside looking in. No one will know that we are Haitian Americans, that we are Black immigrants, just by looking at us. When we come to this country, when we participate in everything that this country has to offer, we are Black, we are visibly African American, and nobody can look at us and deny that of us until we probably say our names or talk about our experiences. So we are, we fit right into everything, all the stereotypes, all the injustices, everything that lumps Black people together. We benefit from it, and we are susceptible to the same things. So when we are writing about these issues, we are writing about issues that affect us as well, but we also bring the perspective of not being the direct descendants of American chattel slavery, but we are descendants of a revolution. We are descendants of corrupt governments. We are descendants of dictatorships. We're coming from countries where, what does it look like when your oppressor looks just like you? And we understand from a larger perspective what white supremacy does to a whole country, to a Black nation. So I personally cannot deny all those perspectives that make me a Black immigrant and a Black person living in America. And it's a benefit, I truly think. So in terms of that, for punching the air, I came from the perspective of being an immigrant child in New York City, experiencing the Central Park 5 jogger case. And my mother not blinking an eye and said, like they probably did it. Only because she was mugged.
No.
Right? She was mugged. But me being a sixth grader looking at the boys in my classroom and saying, like, wait a minute. Like my political stance was sharpened because I had a home experience and then a school experience and then, the people that I know. So at a very early age, I knew that my mother was wrong about certain things. And I wasn't growing up in a household where immediately, like, okay, Black people, face injustices. The household was just like, yeah, we say just injustices in Haiti, but this is the promised land, right? Right?
Yeah.
And
I would definitely want to dig in a little bit more about the problematic nature of Black immigrants coming to America. So, and really what all of that is rooted in is white supremacy and the way that it manifests within the country and Black immigrants coming from other places as well. So I very much remember growing up in Miami, and whether it was the white Cuban kids or, fellow Black kids, whether they are, Jamaican or Bahamian or Black American, whatever the case may be, looking at someone who like me and learning that I'm Haitian and saying like, oh, do you eat cat, right? So there's all of this idea of what it means if you're a Haitian immigrant. But then there are also ideas, which I would say in essence is perpetuated by media and lack of proper representation of Black folks presented in other countries outside of the United States about what it means to be Black in America. So when you look at the types of television programs and things that go overseas and they're portraying this very narrow vision of what it looks like to be a Black American, then you have Black immigrants who come here and they think we need to make sure that we, present ourselves in a different way. When in reality, there is no difference. Police aren't stopping a Black person on the street and saying, you, Black person, are you Haitian American? No, they shoot you first. And then if they find out you aren't from this country, they might send you back. So I think that we as even within the Black community needs to be able to evolve and realize how much of white supremacy impacts people, whether you are Black American, Black from another place. At the end of the day, Black is Black, blackity black, Black walk with the Black, say with the Black. So it just becomes this weird, almost like people call it the oppression Olympics, where it's like, oh, who's being persecuted the most? Who's being followed the most, or all of these things, when at the end of the day, we are all at a disadvantage. And I wish people would take more time to realize how much of the things that we want and need from this society would benefit if there was some idea of unity. So one thing I was actually thinking about this last night, if reparations were able to be passed here in the United States, right, for the injustices that Black Americans face, while my family, because they came from Haiti, might not benefit, what do you think it would tell to the world if the United States paid back the Black folks who were wrongfully enslaved? So then when the French and Haiti tries to go back to the French and says, hey, you need to pay us reparations too, it sets a precedent. And then when you think of how the Haitian Revolution was a spark for different things that happened here in the United States, you realize how so much of what other Black people do ends up benefiting one another because of that shared experience of Blackness being persecuted globally.
Yeah, it's an excellent point that you are all making, and the challenge I think, for Black people all over the world is white supremacy does not just exist here in the United States. It permeated the entire planet through colonialism and imperialism. And when I was based in Africa, for example, many of the things that we see here in the United States, I saw in Africa. I saw people in Nigeria, for example, who were wealthy and who had a certain class treat people who work, for example, at a country club much the same way that whites would have treated them 100 years ago if they were working before Nigeria gained its independence and Britain was still its colonizer, and the British occupied and frequented this country club. No Nigerians were allowed to join that country club. The British were kicked out. Nigeria gained its independence in 1958, and all of a sudden they're in charge. And yet the white supremacy is so ingrained in the rest of the world that they were behaving oftentimes much in the same way as their oppressors had behaved. And that is something you see it in Haiti. We can get into the politics of a country that just celebrated its independence, and as you say, provided an enormous light to Black Americans specifically because of the first independent Black republic in the world, which still has problems because of colorism and the way that we treat each other from the islands. Like, as you said, oh, that person's Jamaican, better not trust them, or the way somebody might even say, well, that person's from Guadeloupe or Martinique. Same, practically very similar cultures. And yet because that island is a part of France, even people who are Haitian sometimes feel a little bit of an inferiority complex around people who come from Martinique or Saint Martin or Guadeloupe. So it's interesting. And I guess the question that follows for me is, how much baggage do you, how much, when you're coming up with characters for your stories, how much of this baggage goes into developing them and to creating them? Because I don't think people understand as authors that oftentimes you create a backstory for your characters that probably goes back to the day that they were born. I mean, you probably know everything about these sisters. You know all about your characters, Ibi, the same way that I know like my little sister's backstory.
Mm-hmm. For one of the good ones, we definitely did lots of thinking and imagining of who our characters were, things that don't get into the story, but we know. And so we decided to touch on a few different ideas that we're incredibly passionate about. So our characters, Happi, Kezi, and Genny, they are named after Joe.
Oops, I think we were a little frozen. Am I the only one? Am I?
Yeah, no, they're frozen too.
They're frozen.
Yeah, I'm not frozen.
Okay.
I can answer.
Yeah. How much? I'm always curious about that. I wonder oftentimes when you're developing a character, do you give them more baggage, more of the weight of the world than is sometimes humanly? In other words, we're sometimes not able to carry all that baggage ourselves as living, breathing humans. Are you able to indulge your characters with having just a little bit more that might not be as easily sustainable in real life?
I try to, and I think Maika and Maritza do the same. We try to give our characters as much nuance as possible, so we model them after real people. We can't, or else the character falls flat. It's usually in movies and in books that two-dimensional characters, they're either good or bad. We want well-rounded, multi-dimensional, nuanced, layered characters. So we pull from personal experiences and the people that we know in real life. I was trying to see what Maritza was saying about one of the characters being named after, and I'm trying to remember who the characters is because I wanted to hear what she was going to say. Her characters have very interesting name, Kezi and Happi.
Genny with a G.
Yes. So I like that, the fact that they took liberties to do that. I do that as well, and I think a lot about my characters' names, the backgrounds that they come from. and the kind of challenges that they're dealing with, because we are ultimately writing about 15, 16, 17-year-olds. And while we want to make them nuanced and well-rounded, we have to remember that they have not fully evolved into adulthood yet. They're on the brink of adulthood and they're still trying to figure things out. And when we write books like social justice books like the ones we're writing, we have to add a lot more depth to who they are, because they are kind of ordinary kids dealing with extraordinary circumstances. And by extraordinary, I don't mean that they're always great circumstances. It just means that they're carrying the weight of their world on their shoulders for that particular moment, for the, in which the story takes place.
Are you, how much of the character, oh, here we go. Maybe coming back. Hey.
2020 is giving us residual effects.
I know, it's a little residue there, a little aftertaste. So you were just talking about the names of your characters and who they were named after, and the inspiration for them. So take us through that.
Yes. Ooh, okay, we're back. Imagine if that had happened in person. Like, okay, but
sounds like a Ready Player One sequel.
We named our characters actually after Job, a man from the Bible who was famous for all the terrible things that happened to him in his life. And then after all the really bad things happened, God rewarded him by having lots of kids and 3 daughters named Jemima, Kezia, and Leah, and or Karen Happick. And we decided to give a nod to those girls from the Bible, because so often the women in the Bible are not named and kind of ignored. Like, the Bible will say that this guy begat this guy who begat this guy, and you don't talk about the women that helped make these children. And our characters are the children of a pastor, and we are also the kids of a pastor and grew up in a really religious household. So we wanted to tap into that kind of that sexism and misogyny that you often find in the church. One of our characters, Kezi, is a lesbian, and we wanted to talk about how your identity is they continuously overlap. So you aren't just Black, you aren't just gay, you aren't just a woman, like you are all of these things at once. So someone might understand and recognize your disadvantage, or not a disadvantage, but your marginalization in one way as a Black person, but then also be oppressing you in another way because of your sexuality, which is something that we see in real life. So we wanted to tackle some really relevant topics in our story that we have experienced growing up ourselves.
I wonder, for the 3 of you, how much being Haitian American, what that does to your storytelling process and perspective on when you're developing characters and when you're thinking about the story that you want to tell. I asked that because we were talking about this a little earlier. I sometimes think to myself that my parents probably did not equip me with the tools to deal properly with the United States of America as it exists, as has existed for 400 years. And I say that because, to the point that you were making earlier, that we have Black skin and we are clearly Black people, but the early point that Ibi was making, which is that, there has always been in not just the Haitian American community, but in the African American, and I mean African people who come from Africa, not people who were brought here, 400 years ago. There's always a sense of, no, we have more in common with somebody who is an immigrant from Ireland or an immigrant from Korea, and less in common with African Americans, people who came here as chattel slavers, as enslaved people 400 years ago. And that meant that when I was growing up, and this is like going back now, this is like in the 70s, but it meant that when I was confronted with things that would happen to me, micro or much larger than a microaggression, I almost didn't know what to think of it because it didn't factor in. If I came back from school and I said to my mom, you know, she said, why did you get a B and not an A? And I'd say, well, you know, I'm the only Black kid in the class, and I don't know, I don't think the teacher likes Black people. She would say, well, that doesn't matter, you still got to get an A, right? And like the notion of, or the notion of like, you know, the SATs being, you know, biased against people of color. They don't care about that because they'll just say, well, how come your best friend who's Korean American, you know, got a perfect score? Why can't you? You know, so I wonder how that perspective plays into how you think about your characters when you're coming up with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on individual experiences. And that's why so many times when Black folks in publishing are saying that there aren't enough Black stories, because what ends up happening is as an author, or especially as a Black author, you write your story and people start to think, oh, this then becomes representative of every story. So somebody reading one of the good ones will be like, okay, this is a representative story about, you know, racial injustice regarding Black women in America. But that is just one character's iteration of that. And I would say I can only speak to my experience, especially as a young Black girl growing up in Miami-Dade County. I was aware of my Blackness, and there was really no way to ignore that. The schools that we went to growing up were inner city schools. It was predominantly Black students, a lot of Caribbean students. And I would say I became more hyper aware of my Blackness when I went away to school, and I was at Florida State. And I literally remember being on the school bus and being like, oh my God, where did all these white people come from? Because that was not my reality growing up. But I also understand, you know, just some of the ways that my Haitian American identity intersects with my experiences in the world. So I can understand where maybe somebody who comes from, let's say, a non-Black immigrant background comes from, but I also understand what a Black American going through different things in the United States also goes through. And I would argue that if you are, you know, a Black immigrant, sometimes you have this idea that you're feeding into this model minority stereotype, and it really doesn't benefit anyone. I think we need to move away from the idea that there is a good one, that your respectability can save you, because it won't. Because we see this every day. We see this on the TV right now. You see people storming the steps of the capital of this nation that so many people migrate to in hopes of a better life. And you get here and the country says your nation is a shithole country. And then you're forced to kind of grapple with that and think this was supposed to be a better life. But then you need to understand what it means and the realities of it and the ways that Black people are persecuted in this country, how it manifests as a Black writer in my writing. I'm hyper aware of that because this Blackness doesn't go away. When I walk into a room, depending on the room, if it's a whole bunch of Black people, maybe they don't focus on my Blackness at that moment, but I'm still Black, they might focus on my womanness, right? Or if I go into a space where there is white people, they'll see my Black womanness first, right? If at all, if they even acknowledge my womanness or femaleness, you know. But I really think that there needs to be an evolution of people thinking that some type of respectability will save you. And that's really what we want to get through with one of the good ones, because really what's more respectable than being a little kid playing in a park? What's more respectable than being in your home, sleeping in your bed? Those should be your American fundamental rights. But we know that if you have Black skin, no matter if you are born in this country or not, you will be persecuted here. And I think that, you know, Black immigrant or not, we need to understand that and wrap our minds around that and be able to understand the nuances of that.
Maritza, you want to add to that?
I would just add that even if you don't have those same exact experiences yourselves, when you do get to read books about Black people and Asian people and Latinx people and every other individual out there, you're reading specific stories that are representing wide groups of people, but at the same time, like, you'll still be able to identify somehow with that character, even if you don't look like them. So there's always something to be gained with the stories. There's a scholar, Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, who talks about how books are mirrors, you know, it's an opportunity to look and see yourself and feel like you're a part of the world, that you exist. But then there are also books that act as windows where other people can peek inside and have a glimpse at someone else's experience. And then you might look inside and say, oh, I have that shirt, or I have a chair that looks like that too, you know, since we are at the end of the day all human beings, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. So that's a good question for you, Ibi. I wonder, and we were talking about this a little earlier. I was with the sisters, which is when I was growing up, I love to read. I still do. It was like I was, you know, chalk it up to being an immigrant, or just the fact that my parents didn't care about sports, but like I was the kid who could not play like any American sport. Like I could kick a soccer ball, but back in the day, that wasn't as popular as it kind of is now. And so I was a huge bookworm. I was an introvert. My parents would take me to, you know, people that they called our cousins, and I would sit there and just go into a room with a book and like never show up. But the books that I read, and I had a conversation recently with somebody about this on Twitter. You know, I love the Judy Blume books, and I love the Beverly Cleary books. And I used to read this series of book called The Great Brain, which I just absolutely adored, by a guy named John D. Fitzgerald, which I just, you know, and those were, and Encyclopedia Brown, and, you know, but I never read books, most of those Judy Blume books, or The Outsiders, S.C. Hinton, those books didn't really include people that look like me or that look like us. And I you know, and one of the things that I love about, like, you know, I know we hated 2020 and it wasn't the greatest year, but in the millennium, what I found is that there are young authors like you who are writing books for people, or not for people, but that include people that are more representative of this country. And those books are, you know, they're New York Times bestsellers, as yours are, and they're being made into movies. And you know, did you think about that? Did you, when you guys were coming up, when you were writing your first books, did you even think to yourself, you know, I'm not going to write a book about, you know, a young girl living in Greenwich, Connecticut, because maybe that's not my experience. I'm going to write this other book about people that I know, and because I want people to be able to relate to, where maybe there are some people in this country who haven't found books that they can relate to in that way.
So, you know, I want to acknowledge that we're all probably from different generations, and generations not being like a 25-year gap, but maybe a 5-year gap.
Mine is probably a 25-year gap.
I grew up in New York City in the 80s. Okay, I went to high school in the 90s. So my childhood was in the 80s, New York City. So, and I'm Maritza and Maika, we've talked about this a little, you know, and being Haitian in New York City in the 80s, we got the full gamut, you know, Haitian booty scratcher, you know, all of that. I hate to repeat it, but
No, and can I just, not to interrupt you, Ibi, but it's, you know, you're making an excellent point, and I just want to add one little tiny thing to it. Those kinds of comments that young people made back then, I was, you know, I was in high school in the 80s, so I was a little older. I graduated from high school in 87. So, and I went to probably, my high school in New York was so bad that they closed it. But like
high school?
It was Springfield Gardens High School.
Oh, you grew up in Queens too?
I grew up in Queens. I was born in Queens.
Cambria, I lived in Cambria Heights.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah. So Queens, you know, and you know, what I recall about New York in the late 70s and the early 80s was, especially as the AIDS epidemic was starting to become a thing, there was that myth that, you know, that AIDS came from Haiti and from Haitians. And that was, you know, something that was really, really hard to overcome. But ultimately that went away, right? As people in this country recognize that Haitians as a minority group and as an immigrant group are some of the most highly educated groups of immigrants in this country and some of the most successful, until President Trump said, you know, allegedly to one of his aides, oh, Haiti, everybody there has AIDS. And I remember thinking to myself, you know what, of course he would say that because he was around New
Yeah.
York in the 1970s
Yeah.
and the 1980s. He's a product of Queens, like
Yeah.
we are.
Mhm.
And I just thought, I remember thinking to myself, my nephews who are like 11 and 15
Don't know that.
would not know anything about what that means.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we know. But we know.
Right, right. Do you ladies know Maritza and Maika?
Yeah, totally. I mean,
Um,
yeah, I mean, well, actually, I spoke already.
Even growing up in Miami, in a like, you know, with little Haiti around the corner, like there still was the stereotype that Haitian people were dirty or just you didn't want to be Haitian. I mean, I remember this one time in second grade when someone, a peer of mine was like, "Ew, you're Haitian," and I was like, "No, I'm not Haitian," and I literally felt like Peter when he denied Jesus 3 times. Like I just felt like so bad after. I got over that, but it certainly helped when I moved to a school that had a more sizable Haitian American student population. So yeah, it was tough. And I actually do wonder about that sometimes, like today, like how kids growing up in the 2020s, oh my gosh, we're in 2020. In this time period, like what it's like to be Haitian and if they have to fulfill those same stereotypes.
So my little brother, who's a millennial, who's about 12, 13 years younger than me, he had Wyclef in 97 and that was a wrap. He's more Haitian than I am and he's never been. But in Queens, at high school, there was more pride and you saw Haitian rappers, you know. Wyclef knocked it out the box, you know, and then that was it. But we didn't have that. We had the Haitian boat people in Duvalier. And I'm tying it back to your question, Vladimir, of why we how we write and how we decide on that character is based on those experiences. I read the Judy Blume books as well, but I was never looking for culture, my specific type of Black books. I saw it outside, like I saw home culture. The type of stories that my parents were telling family members was about Duvalier, was about somebody who disappeared, somebody who got disappeared back home in Jérémie or something like that. There were always political stories and stories about back home. I can tell you the moment and the book that changed everything for me. It was Edwidge Danticat's Quick Clock, which I saw first in a Black bookstore, and then Edwidge Danticat's Breath Eyes Memory being Oprah's book club pick in 1998. And when I opened that book, that story is set in my mother's hometown of Damari. And at the same time, I discovered Octavia Butler, who I share a birthday with. I felt a connection. And I'm also learning about Haitian Vodou and spirituality. And I saw that in Zora Neale Hurston books. And I saw sci-fi and I saw Haiti in its reality. And I decided I wanted to combine all those words, all those worlds in those books. So I can't say that I never saw it. I never saw it in children's book, but I wasn't looking for it in children's book. It was an adult novel. So I was lucky enough to know that Zora Neale Hurston had an affinity for Haiti. I was like a dancer and I knew Catherine Dunham loved Haiti as well. So I saw and I knew that Langston Hughes wrote about Haiti. So all of that was part of my foundation for writing the stories that I wanted to write.
So, I recognize that you guys were lost for like a couple of minutes. So I went a little longer than we wanted to before we take some questions. But I'm gonna grab some questions here because I've been seeing them popping up. So let me just reach over to the Q&A here and see what we got. Okay. What scene or chapter was your favorite to write? And what was your least favorite to write? That comes from Becca Hildner.
Ooh.
That's a great question.
Hi, Becca. Okay, so a scene or chapter that was my favorite to write. I would say my favorite chapter, well, the thing is, Maritza and I, we don't tend to always break things out by chapters. So sometimes she'll start writing a chapter and then I'll start, and then we kind of go back and read the other person's writing and comb through it to make it sound cohesive. But I really liked the scene where they go to we made it up, but it's basically like this dude ranch where they're experiencing Black cowboys for the first time. If you look at American pop culture, you would think that there are no Black cowboys. All of the, cowboys are white men. But really, Black folks have been there since the beginning. And so we wanted to include a nod to that by, creating this, fake stop while they're on their journey, where they're learning about essentially how Black cowboys came to be and the history of that. And as they're learning about this, they learn about, I would say, a cow girl or cow woman. And I mentioned her, I think it was yesterday, but Stagecoach Mary. And she essentially was the first Black woman, or one of the first Black women, to hold a role in what we consider the United States Postal Service. And she was just a total badass. She used to be a nun in a convent before, but she ended up leaving because she got into a disagreement with someone on the convent property, one of the maintenance people, and they pulled the guns out on each other and they kicked her out. And she became this horseback riding, drinking, swearing, gun-toting badass. And I think that's really fascinating. So I really enjoyed writing that part.
I think that I loved any moment where I could write about the sisters butting heads in some ways, because I love arguing with my sisters, and
She's a troll.
yes. So that was fun. And I also was really drawn to the character of Evelyn, who is one of the people that you meet who actually lived in the past in our story. So we incorporate the Negro Motorist Green Book, which you probably know is that it was kind of like a yellow pages for Black people to travel safely across the country because of segregation and Jim Crow laws. And Evelyn was an individual who is actually what is it called? An ancestor of our characters in the present day. And she used the Green Book, and you see how she's tied to Happi and Kezi and Genny today. And she was a teen growing up, trying to argue with the cute boy that kept bothering her on the block, but then ends up being enveloped in a much bigger story. So that was a really fun part of the process.
Ibi, do you, is it hard? I think it was Patty Chayefsky, the screenwriter, who once said, somebody said to him, describe the process of writing. And he said, oh, it's really easy. You turn on, you put a piece of paper in your typewriter and you stare at it until beads of blood start to drip from your forehead, and then you start to write. And so do you find the process of writing really difficult, or does it just flow from your mind onto the page?
I really think storytellers are born and not made. I think I know it's true for you both, Maika and Maritza, that your brain does not shut off. You're constantly thinking of story. I got, I'm plotting my novel right now as I talk to you. It doesn't, and it's just that I believe we're thinkers. You're a form of a storyteller too, as a journalist, Vladimir. We're constantly observing and we're trying to connect the dots. And for us novelists, we just take all of that information and put them into fictional characters who aren't really fictional. I really think they're based on people that we know, and we make comments about the world. The hard part is getting the words down on the page. The hardest part is revising. The even harder part is having editors and agents who don't necessarily look like us and who don't come from our experiences, just looking at our stories and making comments, whether they're helpful or not. Sometimes that is sometimes challenging to me, because we have to sometimes explain to readers who just don't always have the context for what we're trying to say. And I personally have to keep that in mind when I'm putting words on the page, And I personally, I want to ask the sisters a question. just do you feel, and Vladimir too, as in your line of work, do you constantly feel that you have to represent Haiti in some way in whatever it is that you do?
I'll let the sisters,
I'm
ladies
not-
first.
This is my only like genuinely Haitian novel. And then I have another book with a character who's half Haitian, but Haiti and Haitian culture does not come up at all. And that's it for me, you know, until my next project.
Yeah, I know Mertz and I have spoken about this. We want to write what we want to write. And we honestly, it's going to come off like we're not worried about how people will think of that, right? So sometimes that might be we write a book where it's totally focusing on our Haitian culture. Like our first book that we were really blessed to be able to start our publishing careers with is Dear Haiti, Love Elaine. And yes, it is totally delving into her identity as a Haitian American. And I think even I was just talking about this with Maritza, people think about Dear Haiti, Love Elaine and they really focus on the Haitian identity that she's grappling with through the story, but there's a lot of her American identity that's in there as well. She introduces herself as using the superheroes' origin stories to describe herself. Her favorite book is Alice in Wonderland. There are lots of things kind of interspersed throughout. So we were able to really, you know, delve into that dual identity of being both Haitian and American, sometimes not feeling Haitian enough, not feeling American enough. And then, you know, it just bleeds together until it creates you. And in one of the good ones, if, you know, if the readers are reading closely, they'll find that our characters are distantly Haitian, where their mother has a relative who is from Haiti. And we also try to, you know, sneak some information about Haiti in there, like the first mayor, not the first, was it the first? The founder of Chicago being of Haitian descent, or how Louisiana being purchased by the United States from France was because of the Haitian Revolution, and how expensive it became for France to maintain the war in Haiti. And so they needed money and they sold Louisiana, which was a French territory at the time, to the United States. So we try to inject it in there, but whether or not we are focusing specifically on our Haitian identity, I don't know that. It really depends on the story, and where we can, we'll like interject and try to let folks know things, but we want to write when we want to write, whether it's YA, middle grade, adults, nonfiction, whatever the case may be. We don't want to be, we always want people to be like wondering like, well, what are they going to do next?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I love that about the three of you, that, you know, that it's not, you're not there to be, as you said earlier, Maritza and Maika, you're not there to represent the island of Haiti, or the Haitians that live there, or those that are here. You're there to tell your truth and to share your art, and that springs, you know, it comes from within. You are Haitian American, so that's part of it. But you should be, and everybody should feel free to speak and write and create their truth, especially when it comes to art, which I've always believed. For me, it's like I probably don't think. I guess for me, and this is interesting because I've never been asked this question before. A lot of my life has been spent like trying not to embarrass my mother. That's the first, like, you know, because as long as you look good, this is all I want. And you know, and so I suspect that that a part of that comes from, you know, the fact that my mother and my grandmother had very strong notions of how young people and how their children should comport themselves in society. So there's a little bit of that. But I've tended to, specifically in the work that I do, have tended to find commonality with other immigrants, because I think that, you know, that all of us who have come to this country, or our parents who came to this country, have very similar experiences. They may be different in terms of our individual experiences and things that we individually go through, but collectively, I find that when I talk to my wife, for example, who's Chinese American, was born here, but her parents are from China, or I talk to, you know, friends of mine or colleagues of mine who are like me, first generation. I interviewed a guy yesterday who is, who was a Jeopardy champion, and he's Indian American. And we started talking, and we found that we both joined the United States military because we wanted people to think of us as real Americans. And that had nothing to do with being necessarily Haitian or him being Indian. It had to do with being an immigrant in America and always feeling as if you have to prove your loyalty. Or, I remember as a young kid, again, this is going back, late 70s, early 80s. I remember like I used to annoy the F out of me that my parents like had these thick accents, and I remember once I will admit to this, like, because it's, but I'm very ashamed. I'm very ashamed. I'm going to say that right now, that I think I told my stepdad once, like, America, love it or leave it. Like, I'm growing up in the Reagan years, and that's a language that you're hearing. You talked about pop culture in the media, and that's the language you're hearing, and you so want to identify with that you end up using this really horrible language to your parents. And I remember my mom saying, I've been speaking English longer than you've been on this earth. So like, back up, buddy.
I would say that's the insidiousness of just white supremacy and making you hate in yourself, right? That the thing that sprouts from you, that you grow up with, that's nourishing you and giving you, helping form you, can then become this source of like, oh, I need to make sure that I'm transcending this, when really that's not the case. Because we know that I was reading Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, and he talks about uplift suasion and how so many Black folks will fall into the idea that if you make sure you carry yourself a certain way, you walk a certain way, you talk a certain way, then they'll consider you good, which will then help raise up the race, when in reality, folks will look at that one person as the exception and not the rule. Because when a Black person does something, whether it's good or if it's bad, it's representative of the race. If it's good, it becomes you are the exception, you are the magical person, you are the, they have a name for this, I'm blinking on it right now. So really, I hope that, and this kind of ties back to one of the good ones, I just really want folks to consider all the ways that we harm others around us and even ourselves by falling into this idea of what it looks like to be X. You should just be yourself, and you being a human being should be enough for you to matter and for people to value you. And I would say that's what we really would like readers to take away when they read one of the good ones.
Let me just ask one last question that comes to us from somebody who's participating in this. And it comes from Lydia Ann Mary. She asks, how are you able to she actually asked two questions. I thought I saw one. Yeah, here it is. Do you feel like you see yourselves in your books, or did you write this so that others can see themselves because books like these weren't available to you back then?
Oh, well, when I heard that,
I know. It's like,
I immediately thought of I'm every woman. So like, I am writing for me, but I know that there are so many women, as in humans, out there who can also really see themselves, a portion of themselves in the story. Like anything that you open up to pour through, you're going to identify with some aspect of it. And if for some reason there's nothing there, at the very least, you have learned something new. And I really want to write and hope that my work comes off as a place for people to see themselves, but then also really delve into these particular characters, because they are speaking to larger issues out there, but they are also talking about the individual experiences that they, as Happi and Kezi and Genny, are going through themselves too.
Ibi?
Wait, what was the question? I'm still
So
hearing.
are you writing, when you think about the books that you've written, and you think about the books that you said you're thinking about what you want to write now, do you want young people, for example, to see themselves reflected in your stories? Do you find you yourself are reflected through the prism of your characters?
I am definitely I definitely write myself into my books. And I want to say it's less about young people seeing themselves in books, because I want to take the onus away from publishing as an industry, and publishing houses as corporations. I really want to take it back to when we played in the streets in New York City. They played outside, right, in Miami.
Yes.
Where this,
It's just
our
hard.
culture,
Only until the
right?
street light. When the street
Right.
light closed, you were coming inside.
So I want to take it back to this idea of we created culture. We were the innovators of culture when we played with each, we played games, when we made up games. Like hip hop is just about kids being outside and making something out of nothing. And this is where the stories live, not always within the pages of books. I really truly believe that books are there to document the reality. They're there, they live in the Library of Congress, they have an ISBN number, and they are there for us to tell the future generations that we were here. This is what we did, this is what we thought, this is how we interacted with society and each other, this is how we evolved as human beings. So I'm not of the mind of children constantly looking for validation from something that can be commodified. What they create amongst themselves is not something that publishing houses can make a buck off of.
Mhm.
Ultimately, when they can document their experiences to say, pay me, I'm putting this within the pages of the book, this is when it becomes not just valuable for them, but valuable for culture in general. So I think those are two distinct things. Culture as a living, breathing thing that people create amongst themselves versus the culture that exists within the pages of a book that corporations can commodify. So in that sense, I feel like I'm a journalist. I'm documenting. And this doesn't always have to be a mirror, but a record. So that's how I like to look at it.
Let me let me follow up with this last question before we wrap this up, because I think it sort of is a jumping off point to the point you were just making, Ibi. So I'll ask you for your answer first, and then I'll go to the sisters. This comes to us from Elizabeth Stemmer. She asked, "How do you manage to focus your stories in such a way that you are able to engage multiple angles and issues without becoming preachy or doing too much in terms of what your characters experience?" Or more simply, they ask, how do you keep your stories grounded?
I think I'll just say that they're based on real people, While I say I'm documenting stuff, like, yeah, I am documenting. I am documenting to say, hey, there is a Haitian girl, who moves to Detroit and has to navigate with a Loa, who lives on the corner. And that's part of her worldview and her imagination. And with Dear Haiti, Love Elaine, I can relate to this girl who's just very American and Haitian in very unique and specific ways. And I see that as a documentation, and it's already grounded for me, because these are based on people that I know and people like me. So it's on the ground for me. Even if we were to write a fantasy book about Haitian culture, maybe the Haitian Revolution, hint, hint. It would be grounded in reality, in a very real thing, that the Haitian people, took their freedom from the clutches of the French. So yeah, this is what we do, and it's craft. Also, it's craft.
Yeah, and
right?
I would say as Black authors, sometimes that's a big task because of the lack of representation that we have, right? So I definitely agree with Ibi in the idea that publishing companies are profiting off of these ideas, but we know that as human beings, we are consuming this media. And for that reason alone, we deserve to see ourselves reflected on the pages. And the stories that we tell, and one of the good ones is only our second novel, but for Dear Haiti, Love Elaine and one of the good ones, we incorporated history into that. So we do want to teach as we seek to entertain, but we also know that we take creative licenses. If you read Dear Haiti, Love Elaine or one of the good ones thinking, okay, this is the history of Haiti, this is the history of Black American experience in United States, you're going to find that we made stuff up because we're writers and we can do that. So I hope that people read the book, they are intrigued, and then they go and find out more for themselves and do the research and then do the work to make sure that we can move away from this idea of one of the good ones and then hopefully
one day make this a more equitable world and honestly liberate us all.
I love that sentiment, and it's so important, especially now, to sort of reiterate that. That it strikes me that one of the things that I loved about growing up in a non-digital world, is not being a millennial, was that the books were this window into a world that I would only learn about through just lying in my bed under the covers with a flashlight and reading about this world and then wanting to know more. So that was the great thing about books. And as you say, it wasn't that I learned every little bit of history. For example, I used to love to read biographies as a kid. And I read, a child's biography of John F. Kennedy. And I remember thinking to myself, well, this can't be everything that's in this. And also it was one of those like little thin, like kids books, right? So I told my mother to take me to the library, and then I took out like a thicker book, and then another book, and then another book. And it was never going to be the end all be all. I sometimes worry. I love that there are authors like the three of you who are writing with this perspective, because it has been lacking. I find it remarkable that I can sit and binge watch Outlander like every season of this like show based in like 17th century Scotland, and think to myself, like, why has no one ever done something about Toussaint Louverture or like the Haitian Revolution? Like, why did we have to watch Braveheart, which is it was an exciting movie when it came out, but like the Haitian Revolution is 10 times more exciting than Braveheart, and it's never been done, and that is like fascinating to me that those roadblocks still exist. So when I see books and works of art like the three of you producing, it just gives me hope that we're rounding this corner, that ultimately there will be people who will experience even if it's a minute perspective of the Haitian experience through the works that from your works, that they may not have been exposed to by just reading a Judy Blume book or a Beverly Cleary book. So thank you guys.